So on Monday, I mentioned it was my birthday, and on that day in 1996, Damon Hill finally became Formula 1 World Champion. So now we are almost as far away from 1996 as 1996 was from 1966. Send help. As many like to point out, the 1996 season is the season I love the most, probably because it's the first season I remember watching in full. And the season opened with that crash for Martin Brundle on the opening lap of the opening Grand Prix. And 4 months prior to that crash, Mika Häkkinen was in intensive care in an Australian hospital. So it showed how far Formula 1 had come from the carnage that had been going on in the previous couple of years. And that crash, Brundle's crash that is also the opening to the brilliant documentary One Life on the Limit. If you haven't watched it, do so. It's fantastic. And I said during the video on the 1995 Australian Grand Prix that 1995 going into 1996 was the start of modern Formula 1 as we know it. For 1996, the current start system was used for the first time, the 5 red lights coming on and then going out 3 to 5 seconds later. The high cockpit size came in for 1996, the TV deals were expanding, and Formula 1 was becoming more and more of a household sport. Helped in part by Murray Walker's enthusiastic commentary, Damon Hill's status as the People's Champion, and the free-to-air broadcasts on a Sunday afternoon on Sunday Grandstand. BBC F1 introduced by Fleetwood Mac's The Chain. John McVie's iconic bass line coming through your speakers. And I know we talk about how The Chain is synonymous with British Formula 1 broadcasts, but do spare a thought for Keith Mansfield, who wrote the theme tune to Grandstand. Saturday and Sunday afternoons will never be that good again. And I'll put a link to one of the Grandstand intros in the description for this video for those that never got to watch it. But 1996 would be the final season of Formula 1 on the BBC before it shifted over to ITV, because, in Murray's own words, ITV was sick of being destroyed by the BBC in ratings every other Sunday afternoon. But elsewhere, things were changing. Schumacher had gone to Ferrari, with the attitude towards that being much like when Hamilton went to Mercedes. Why? Ferrari was terrible at that time. But with some of the best minds at Benetton going with him, Ferrari looks set to improve. David Coulthard meanwhile started his long partnership with McLaren in 1996. Martin Brundle would retire at the end of 1996, even though he didn't want to. And the days of the plucky underfunded privateers ended thanks to the 107% rule. All of this is why I say that 1995-1996 is the start of modern Formula 1, rather than 1993 or 1994 or even a little bit before that. And I've put this bit in because some people on that 1995 Australian Grand Prix video asked why I think the way I do. This is why. And while Schumacher had gone to Ferrari in their banter years, he'd actually managed to pull off something in 1996 that a lot of people thought would be impossible. Ferrari did win a race in 1995, that being at the Canadian Grand Prix when Alesi finally won. In fact, Alesi was the only driver not in a Benetton or a Williams to win a Grand Prix in 1995. With the two Benetton and Williams drivers picking up wins through, well, 1995. Ferrari was making progress under Jean Todt, but they needed that one last little push over the edge to get them back to the top. Schumacher had managed to get pole positions at San Marino and Monaco in the A-Spec Ferrari 310, the first Ferrari with a 3-litre V10 engine after years of running the V12 when the return to naturally aspirated engines happened at the end of the 80s. Despite the Ferrari being woefully unreliable, it did have some upsides. It seemed to work well in high downforce environments. The Ferraris were 3rd and 4th on the grid at Melbourne, with Schumacher on the front row at Argentina and then again at San Marino and Monaco with the already mentioned pole positions. While the Ferrari could be good over one lap in Schumacher's hands, it did tend to lose out to superior Williams race pace on Sunday afternoons. Or just not finish at all. And before I get piled on, as mentioned before when talking about the specific Ferrari, Schumacher being the best driver on the grid at this time meant that the car could be in a position to take advantage if the Williams cars had a howler. And by the time they reached the closing part of the 1996 season, Schumacher had managed to do that twice. At Barcelona, the Michael put on one of the best wet weather drives in Formula 1 history, decimating the field with a largely error-free drive, with his slow start being the only downer at that event. Williams meanwhile set their cars up with more dry-minded setups or setups intended for changing weather, like it had been in Brazil, thinking that the conditions would improve over the course of the Grand Prix because weather forecasting wasn't as accurate as it is now. Ferrari put Schumacher on a pure wet setup, and as the Williams cars struggled for grip with Damon spinning off into the pit wall after about 7 laps, Michael trundled on, destroying the field and taking the first of his many wins for Ferrari. Then he did it again at Spa, once again taking advantage of a Williams howler, This time, it was pit stop strategy. The safety car came out after Jos Verstappen totaled his footwork, and that allowed Schumacher to pit immediately. But Villeneuve missed the call, having to do another lap before coming in for his fuel stop. Damon then had to go through the bus stop escape road and also lost time. So Schumacher inherited the lead through the pit stops, and Villeneuve had the same problem that Piastri had in the Belgian sprint race this year. Superior through Sector 2, but dirty air was a problem, and all the cars had roughly the same speed in Sectors 1 and 3. Michael got his car into the position he needed, and snatched it from Williams. So with 2 wins under his belt in 1996, expectation was very, very high for Schumacher and Ferrari when they got to the next round after Belgium, which was at Monza, the second to last European round of the 1996 season. Monza is pure speed, much like Hockenheim was. And Hockenheim in 1996, much like Monza always is, was red. And I mean red. Because in Germany, they'd been there for Schumacher, who was now at the Italian team, so they were all decked out in red. And at Monza, they were going to be decked out in red anyway. And God help you if you're there to support anybody else except Ferrari. It's the home of the Tifosi. You're in their house. They are loud, and their support for their beloved Scarlet cars, well, it's almost a religion. While the Tifosi had been supporters of Gerhard Berger and Jean Alesi the previous year, all the support now was directed at the car that had the number 1 painted on the nose cone. Schumacher. Ferrari's saviour. And the circuit was slightly different in those days. Today we have the super tight turn 1 and 2 chicane that makes sim racers go, yeah, I'll skip qualifying for this one, lads, you go on ahead. Because you just know that you're going to be involved in a turn 1 pileup. The memes are memes, for a reason. And in these days, it was the old setup. The Rettifilio chicane was more chicanes rather than chicane. That's a left-right corner sequence as opposed to the 90s trance DJ. This is roughly what it looked like. I know Automobilista 2 has a version that's pretty accurate, but this is all I have, unfortunately. And I actually do need to get AMS2 at some point, if only to play with the 2 brake pedal McLaren, and the Brabham fan car, come to think of it. This is an R-Factor mod for the 1998 version of the track, but it's a representation of some description, and that's all that matters. Turns 1 and 2 now go the opposite way to how it is now, and not only that, you've got turns 3 and 4 as well. It's a double chicane. The chicane was slightly faster in 1 and 2, but then slows down for 3 and 4. It's quite a tricky section, and some of you are probably going, bring it back. But the problem with this chicane is, if they had kept it and then modified it over the years, they'd have just tightened it anyway. But hold all thoughts that you have about these chicanes, because these chicanes would be the race changers for this year. So how fast could the Ferraris be around this particular track in 1996? Well, on Friday, the Tifosi did get some hope. In practice 1, Schumacher was the fastest overall, with Hakkinen second and the Benetton of Gerhard Berger in third. Williams, meanwhile, were nowhere. But it's first practice, and no trophies are handed out on Friday. Williams might be nowhere now, but give them time. But the thing was, Williams was actually not a very happy place at the minute because of some news that had broken in the previous weeks. The other news was that McLaren and Marlboro would be splitting after 23 years. It was pretty big news, but the bigger news was happening at Williams, and there was a media frenzy as a result. The front page of Autosport was correct. Damon Hill had been sacked. Although it later turned out that he hadn't actually been sacked. After that dreadful 1995 season, Frank Williams had already decided on signing Heinz-Harald Frentzen for 1997, and with Jacques Villeneuve on a multi-year deal, Damon was surplus to requirements. Rumours then spread of Damon asking for too much money from Frank, which he actually had nothing to do with. That was his manager that did that, and Damon didn't even know. And I highly recommend Damon's book for more information about all this. So Hill was left shell-shocked by this revelation, to the point that he actually wanted to punch the journalist that broke the news. That journalist being Andrew Benson, who is now the head journalist for Formula 1 at the BBC. On top of this came more speculation and rumour. Rumours like, Damon's going to Benetton with a lazy to Jordan. Damon's going to go to McLaren to replace Hakkinen. Or he's going to go and join his dad's mate Jackie Stewart for his eponymous team. It carried on. As well as this, there was media speculation that the team might turn its attentions to Villeneuve, since he was going to be at the team for longer. But Damon pushed through the intense media scrutiny that was hanging over his head, and got pole position. Qualifying was actually quite tightly contested. The way the cars were set up in those days and the way that the format was in those days, cars would do several qualifying laps in what I call a hot stint, because it took too long for tyres to come up to pressure in these days. You had 12 laps, so you might as well use them. Some cars would do 2 runs of 6 laps with tenths knocked off here and there. The top 6 were separated by just under a second. Now you might be thinking, that doesn't sound close, and okay, yes, by modern standards it doesn't. But for the time, this was a photo finish. Villeneuve was 2nd, Schumacher 3rd, Hakkinen and Coulthard 4th and 5th, which showed the power of the new Mercedes engine. Alesi was then 6th, with Irvine 7th, Berger 8th, and the Jordans of Brundle and Barrichello rounding out the top 10. If the race could be this close, we were in for a good time. Williams had a bit more of an advantage at Monza than some other cars. They had one at Hockenheim as well, come to think of it, because not only did they have a very powerful engine, they had a car that was much better at cornering than everybody else's. At Hockenheim, you take all the wing off, crank the engine to 11, and then crawl through the stadium section because you gain the time back on the straights. At Monza, you are still flat out for a good chunk of the lap, but you still have to balance the car because of the 3 chicanes, or 4 chicanes in this case, Parabolica and the Lesmos. Williams could balance better than everybody else, and they had more power than everybody else. Ferrari was going to need a miracle if they wanted their first home win since 1988. Too little wing, you're very fast in a straight line, but you lose loads of time through Parabolica and Ascari in particular. You turn the wing up, you get some really good performance through the corners, but in a straight line, you're a sitting duck. They had to get that balance perfect. That said though, according to reports from the time, the Williams wasn't the fastest in a straight line. Through Monza's 3 speed traps, Damon was 9th, 14th and 8th fastest. With how far off they were on Friday, Williams thought that actually maybe Ferrari would be taking the front slot of the grid, but Williams pulled it back through doing an all-nighter on Friday night. Villeneuve also had his IndyCar experience to fall back on. Keeping speeds high with low downforce was his speciality, but on several occasions over the weekend he'd been held up by slower cars. He was pushed off the road by Diniz in the Ligier and also had his car damaged on Saturday by some concrete ripped up by one of the Minardis. But for race day, the 2 Williams cars and, well, everybody else for that matter, were going to be at the mercy of one of the most baffling decisions the FIA ever made. In the wake of the Rubens Barrichello shunt at Imola in 1994, the FIA had been taking a lot of steps to improve safety. Barrichello had been launched by an exit curb, and the FIA decided that maybe they should lower the curbs and standardise the heights. It meant that this accident would likely not happen again. Curb heights at tracks across the calendar were lowered, particularly on corner exit, but the inside curbs could still be pretty high. It also meant that some curbs were ripe for a bit of advantage gaining if cars could handle it. At the Nürburgring and Spa, the chicanes had low curbs that drivers could launch over if they knew what they were doing. Schumacher did it quite often during the Belgian Grand Prix at the bus stop to keep some distance between him and Villeneuve, and the drivers had requested the ones at the Rettifilo be lowered because in 1995 they thought that they were a bit too high. The FIA complied with the request, but afterwards they thought the circuit owners had made the curbs a bit too low. The FIA then thought the drivers might try to take the piss with corner cutting, so they came up with a plan to stop that happening. On the apexes of the Rettifilo and the Roggia, the FIA had installed tyre stacks. But the tyre stacks were there for 2 reasons. Originally, there had been these green and white bollards there instead, but one of the Minardis had hit one of them, ripping it up and exposing some concrete, which Villeneuve later hit, as already mentioned. The tyre stacks were put there as a replacement, and the FIA put them there after consulting the drivers. Those green bollards, by the way, were also present at the chicane at the Nürburgring. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it meant that people had to stay on the track at least. On Saturday, they placed them at just the Roggia, 5 tyres or so tall, but for the race, they were added to the Rettifilo as well and reduced to 3 tyres, and then painted white instead of black to make them easier to see. Damon was now not just racing with the media scrutiny over his future, but if he won the race with Villeneuve lower than 4th, he could win the title in Italy. The race got underway and Hill had a really good battle with Alesi over the course of that first lap. Even though Alesi was in front for a portion of the first lap, Damon managed to end that lap in the lead. Alesi did his usual warp drive launch and went from 6th to 1st by the first corner, but Hill got back in front under braking for the second chicane, or the Lesmos, I can't remember. Schumacher meanwhile dropped from 3rd to 6th, but Villeneuve was going to be in trouble from the start. He clipped one of the tyre stacks at the Roggia on lap 2 and bent his suspension. The tyre on top of that stack came loose and it was hit by Coulthard, breaking his steering and the McLaren going into retirement. With a Williams that had damaged suspension and a damaged floor after cutting the first chicane on the first lap, Villeneuve was then passed by Schumacher. Ahead of him, Alesi hit the tyre stack in a carbon copy of what happened to Villeneuve. The errant tyre was then hit by the other McLaren of Hakkinen, but Hakkinen got away with it in the grand scheme of things. Mika would have to pit for a new nose that dropped him to 17th though. The Michael was now back in 3rd thanks to the errors of Villeneuve and Alesi and the misfortune of the two McLarens. Hill meanwhile was slowly building a lead out front, getting it up to around 4 seconds by about lap 5. On lap 6, a Williams is spotted under the bridge on the exit of the first chicane complex, with the commentators thinking that it was Villeneuve because he'd already been in trouble. But then the camera cuts away and you see a very despondent Damon Hill hanging over the Armco with his head in his hands. Damon was out of the race, so there was no chance of him winning the title at this particular Grand Prix. Just like Villeneuve and Alesi before him, Damon had hit the tyre stacks, but a little bit too hard to be able to continue the race. He'd spun a full 360 and come to a stop almost in the middle of the track. Hill admitted he'd been stupid. He could have won the race and the championship that day, but with Villeneuve in trouble the losses weren't that major, all things considered. He could still win it at Estoril. Alesi now led the race from Schumacher, one Italian team ahead of the other as Benetton was an Italian team from 1996 onwards. Schumacher was waiting for a mistake from Jean, but it never came, so he started saving his tyres, brakes and a tiny bit of fuel as well, because both cars were running similar fuel strategies. If Schumacher could bring his stop time down, it might help him out later on. Alesi pitted on lap 30 and the Michael was told, Hammerzeit. He pitted 2 laps later, got a half-second faster pit stop and turned Alesi's half-second lead into a 5-second deficit. And on a fresh set of tyres in clean air, the Ferrari was handling the best it had ever done. But Michael had to slow down slightly later on in the race because of problems with the brakes. Some things never change. On lap 39, Michael made the same mistake that Villeneuve, Alesi and Hill had done. He clipped one of the tyre stacks with the steering snapping in his hand. But ultimately for Schumacher, the car stayed in one piece and he was able to carry on. He did pick up a slight vibration, but it sorted itself out a few laps later. Schumacher crossed the line 18 seconds ahead of Alesi come the end of the Grand Prix. His Ferrari worked incredibly well in the clean air, and it was a signal of how good the Ferrari could be in Schumacher's hands when it was actually working. The Tifosi were ecstatic. It was Ferrari's first home win since 1988, Schumacher had won the race, Ferrari was making progress. So the dreams for a better 1997 were beginning. It was also the first time Schumacher had ever won at Monza as well, for a bit of pub trivia. Alesi was second, with Hakkinen recovering to a solid third, albeit over a minute behind the race winner, with the two Jordans 4th and 5th, this being after they were nowhere in qualifying. The final point went to Pedro Diniz in the Ligier, with Villeneuve 7th and a lap down. Damon was ruining the lost chance. If he'd kept his car on the road and the reliability held up, he'd have won the championship that day. But even Schumacher reckoned he got lucky with this win. With the way the Williams and Benetton were pulling gaps in the early stages of the Grand Prix, third would have been the most he could have hoped for. Hill, Hakkinen, Alesi, Villeneuve and Coulthard were all caught out one way or another by the tyre stacks. But Villeneuve, Alesi and Hill, it was all driver error. Hakkinen and Coulthard were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, although it's actually not clear if Alesi did get damaged when he hit the tyre stacks. Schumacher though still had to put in those brilliant laps before he pitted to overhaul Alesi and strategise his way into the lead. Although I suppose him hitting the tyre stack himself was luck on his end. He just hit it square on rather than at an angle like the others had done. But for the Tifosi, I don't think they cared. A Ferrari had won at Monza. It doesn't matter how they do it. And if you ever get to see the aftermath with the drivers on the podium and all the Tifosi celebrating, you'd think that Ferrari had just won the World Championship. And funnily enough, the Tifosi had invaded the track after the San Marino Grand Prix where Michael had finished second, and the invasion was so big, the FIA slapped the organisers with a $1 million fine. But the signs for a good 1997 were there. Schumacher's car was improving in terms of pace, and he was able to get his car into a position to take advantage of any issues with the Williams cars. And since the British Grand Prix, it had been a lot more reliable. Irvine retired from this race and it was his 8th retirement in a row, so you might be thinking, well hang on, how is it more reliable if Irvine's had 8 retirements? Well, this was a run that started in Spain, but it was the first time since the Canadian Grand Prix that Irvine's retirement had not been through a mechanical problem. Spain and Italy were driver error, the others, well, they were just Ferrari reliability. Schumacher would not be off the podium for the rest of the season, and it would be the first time since the opening 3 rounds of the year that a Ferrari would finish 3 races or more in a row, which is insane when you think of what would come after the 1996 season. So Damon would have to wait a little bit longer to seal the title. The Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril would be won by Villeneuve to take the title to a showdown at Suzuka, but the story of the day went to Ferrari. The final 4 races of 1996 were very messy for Williams, but in the background, Ferrari was definitely cooking. Is it possible then to think that the final part of 1996 is actually the beginning of the Ferrari turnaround? Because look at the end of the 1996 season and the end of the 1997 season. They'd gone very far off the winners and only just securing second at the final race to being in a shot of taking a driver's title. But that's one for you to discuss down in the comments. You know, with the talk at the start of the video of new eras and new chapters and everything else, this whole 1996 being the start of Ferrari's turnaround does actually make a lot of sense. So then, a look at the 1996 Italian Grand Prix, the tyre stack race, and it made Damon wait a little bit longer for his world title. But at the same time, it showed that Schumacher and Ferrari could not be counted out going in towards 1997. If this has been an interesting look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help with the picture purchases or otherwise contribute to any other expenses that I have to do around here, then there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and any other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for any one and done donations and memberships for anybody who wants to do Patreon but not go through Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.